Hi, my name is David Kraus. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about inclusion, unemployment, and gender and racial relationships. So specifically what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is I'm going to be talking about the relationship of what 100% unemployment potentially means in the future and what kind of effect that's going to have on gender and race in the future. Okay, what kind of effects we're going to see in the workforce. And the reason I chose this specific subject was because one of the things we talked about in class is just how much advances that we've gained as a society over the last 100 years, how women have been moving up in the workforce and how gender and race has become something of a thing of the past in terms of the workforce for almost the last 150 years. And the thing I want to touch on is that potentially all of these progressive traits might actually go away if we're not careful. So let me start off by this. How many of you guys have ever heard of The Economist's Nightmare? Okay, none of you. It's something of it's something of a phrase that we use in economics. Basically what it is in economics, it's the idea of 100% unemployment. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've slowly seen machines move from factories to entire industries to basically taking over entire economies. We've seen humans, on the flip side, having a less and less effect on overall production. One of the things you see in the United States in the beginning is that machines basically replace the vast majority of the United States workforce, and production is immediately tripled. The amount of human productivity, therefore, decreases overall. Now, one of the things we've been saying and seeing over the last couple hundred years is that human productivity has been decreasing very, very rapidly with the advent of more advanced computer robotics, and with the creation of quantum mechanic computers. There's a real and genuine threat to the American worker for being replaced completely by machines. Now, as I've stated before, the United States has made several advances in terms of gender and racial inclusion into the workforce over the last hundreds of years. You start out with the Industrial Revolution, where we have housewives and women just stepping out of the house from housewives to becoming actual factory workers. It was still pretty taboo back then, but nevertheless we saw a massive increase in consumption and production. Because likely, as you would say, if a woman is doing a job of a man, she's making an income, she's naturally going to want to spend that income on something that she can consume, and vice versa. Additionally, if you kind of go through these different lists on this PowerPoint here, we see the Industrial Revolution, World War II, and with the Civil Rights Movement. Every time there's some sort of a societal progressive change, there's also an additional consumption and production gain as well. That's simply just because as minorities and women gain better income, better standing before the eyes of the law, they're going to have the ability to spend their money, they're going to have the ability to produce more, and they're going to be able to add more economic value to the economy as a whole. And so overall, over the last 150 years, we've seen massive gains by women and minorities in the United States workforce. But with the idea of 100% unemployment, all of that essentially goes out the window in the fact that machines are essentially replacing us. So my philosophy behind this presentation was, what kind of trends are we likely to see, starting with the trends that we can observe now, and what kind of trends are we going to likely to see in the future that will lead us to this point? And then on the flip side, what kind of steps can we take to best negate the negative side effects from this progression towards a 100% unemployment? So, for this presentation, I decided to use African American women and Caucasian women over the age of 20 unemployment. These are the unemployment rates for the last 52 years. There was data on white women prior to 1972, but there was nothing recorded for African American women prior to 1972. So I felt that was the best point to start there. There are a number of things you can immediately see from this graph. Number one, you can immediately see that there's about a 10 to 5% difference in unemployment. African American women generally have a higher unemployment rate, and it seems as though overall, when there's a bad economic downturn, there's a higher percentage of them becoming unemployed. And I'll break that down differently. So, one of the things we can immediately note from, as I stated before, one of the things you can immediately note from this graph is the fact that there's an incredible amount of reactivity difference between the two. They both follow the same general trend, which lends insight and actually lends credence to the idea that there's not that much difference between African American women and white women, meaning that their education level is probably the same, their relative poverty level is the same, their ability to get to income is relatively the same. But overall, it seems as though whenever there's a bad economic downturn, they seem to take the brunt of the economic force the hardest, which is kind of interesting. Secondly, we notice that overall, there's an incredible amount of validity, or the trend is generally very volatile for the most part. We do see within the last 10 years, that this trend has slowly been coming down, and it's actually starting to get to the point where it's around the same level as white women. However, for the vast majority of history, however, African American women generally suffer a much higher amount of unemployment validity. Basically means that there's more change overall in their unemployment status. Just to keep point, this data was actually pulled from the exact same days, from the exact same data points, from the original source material. So these data points are exactly the same, but you can clearly see that there's a very big difference overall in general unemployment. So, what kind of trends can we directly, conclusively concur? Well, we can directly concur that Black and white Americans are equally susceptible to negative economic events. We've already stated that before. Downward economic events for African Americans drastically more than Caucasians. As we noted before, there's a drastically higher amount of unemployment loss for Black African Americans than it was for white. Generally, African Americans experience a higher unemployment rate overall. That we can definitely say overall. There was anywhere from a 5 to 10% increase or difference between Black and white African Americans in unemployment at any given time on this graph. And lastly, overall African Americans have a more volatile unemployment cycle. Like I said on that last slide, you can definitely see, even though it changed within the last 10 years, African Americans, for the vast majority of history, have a much more unstable and uncertain economic cycle, unemployment cycle. So, this is where we kind of dive into speculation. Keep in mind that everything I'm about to speculate here before, I have dived into and I found evidence to support this. And so in that way, a lot of the speculation that I'm giving to you today has reason and scholarly reason behind every single one of these. Getting on with the first point. We can infer that African Americans and Caucasians have a relatively equal economic value. As I said before, they follow the exact same trends. So this proves that they probably have an education level that is around the same. They both have a location or a geographic location relative to their workforce that is relatively the same. And so basically this means that African American women for the most part are actually quite equal in terms of their economic value. However, their perceived economic value, the amount of economic value that their employers believe they have, must therefore be very different. Let me reiterate. If I have a $100 bill, then I am worth $100 just standing right here. But if my employer looks at me and he just sees a dollar bill, irregardless of what the number is, he could say, you're only worth $1. And so that's the difference between economic value, actual economic value, and perceived economic value. Next, downward economic events for African Americans drastically more than Caucasians. We can kind of infer that African Americans are more likely to be fired during economic downturns. This was published by this speculation was backed up by a report from the Bureau of Economic Research, and essentially what they talked about was that African Americans are highly more likely to be fired or hired in the event of a negative event. Essentially meaning that if an African American comes into work late or they turn in a bad report or things like that, they're more likely to be fired and let go from their place of work than a Caucasian. Secondly, African Americans generally carry less economic value to their employers than their white colleagues. This essentially talks about how, as we see before in the graph, we see a much higher spike in unemployment than we do see in Caucasians. The reason we can probably speculate this is that they're either easier to let go, they're not holding that much economic value to their employers when they're working in those positions, or the positions that they're working don't have that much job security and therefore don't have as much economic value overall. And as I said before in that last point, they're probably occupying positions that have less job security. Getting on to our third point, generally African Americans experience a higher unemployment rate overall. Now there are a number of ways we can speculate. There's been a lot of debate over exactly how this plays out. Number one is education. Overall, we can generally say that they're less valued by their employers, and there's a number of reasons we can speculate this. Number one, they could be less educated. Number two, they could be in an area where there's just simply less work. There's been lots of data and evidence to support the fact that if an individual is living in an area that has a higher poverty rate, they're going to have a harder time trying to find steady work. So it would suspect that if you had a higher poverty rate, you would have a higher unemployment rate, just because it's harder to find jobs. There was a report put out by the Center for Civil Wellness, which basically talked about how African American, that overall poverty rates are lower in cities. However, there's a larger amount of African Americans and minorities living in metropolitan areas than in rural areas. So overall, even though there's lower poverty rates in the cities, there's still a larger amount of them who are still in poverty. Finally, we're going to get to our last point, which is overall African Americans have a more volatile unemployment cycle. And this is kind of where we start tripping over the last things we spoke before. Generally, they're probably occupying positions that have less job security, and they're being hired and fired more frequently. And so one of the things that I liked about this data that I was able to cover and all of the sources that I was able to cite, which was that they overlapped each other a great deal. There was a lot of redundant and overlapping evidence to support various points on this presentation. And so it kind of led a lot of credence to the idea that overall African Americans are probably less valued by their employers. They carry less perceived economic value to their employers, and therefore they're more likely to be let go when they're fired. They're more likely to be let go or fired in the event of a downward economic turn. So, what does this mean for our overall arc of unemployment at 100%? One of the things we can immediately point out is that in the event of a complete 100% unemployment, or getting close to it, leading up to it, where machines are becoming more and more predominant in economic situations and economic production, things like that, minorities are likely to take the brunt of it, either due to bias, which is untraceable. There are, of course, isolated incidents of employer bias, but for the most part, there's non-statistical evidence to prove it. So it's either to bias or simply being unemployable. This could be for a number of reasons. Again, geographic location, relative poverty level, or education. As I stated before. Another potential thing we can predict is unemployment rates will increase in minorities first, and then into Caucasians. As we just saw before, unemployment is generally higher in minorities than it is in majorities or Caucasians. And so one of the things we can immediately infer from all this data is that minorities, for the most part, if this problem is left unchecked, minorities are going to take the brunt of this problem on first. We're going to see larger amounts of them becoming unemployed or working less paying jobs. And we can generally predict overall that this is going to pretty much undo all the racial and gender-based progressiveness that we've seen in the economic system for the last 100 or so years. We're going to see less women involved in the workforce, we're going to see less minorities in the workforce, and therefore, when you have less of both, you have less equal representation, you probably have more chances of legally less binding, and so essentially the system becomes more skewed and more unfair to the minorities, the disenfranchised, than it does to the ruling body. However, this problem, as I stated before, it's going to start in the minorities, it's going to start with women and minorities, things like that, and it's going to move slowly into Caucasians. So what we can basically infer is that it's going to start in the higher level amounts of unemployment, they're going to increase very quickly, and then so on and so forth, each level increases thereafter. In addition to this, we could definitely point out the fact that unemployment rate and poverty rate are likely to increase at a parallel rate. Essentially, that means is that the number of people who are in poverty and the number of people who are going into poverty every year is going to increase relative to the amount of unemployment rate going into unemployment or being unemployed. There's statistical evidence to prove that wherever you have a higher unemployment rate, you have a higher poverty rate. That's just point logic. And it's vice versa. So those are the number of things we can predict will happen in the advent of a 100% unemployment. And with the United States going on the economic route that it's going on today, one of the things we can definitely predict is that the United States is probably going to be seeing a lot more robotic and mechanicalized development over the next 100 years, just like we've seen in the past. Entire workforces are going to be completely replaced by robotics, with a few oversight seers who can fix the machines or work on the machines, and that's about it. We're going to be seeing factories being able to quadruple the amount of production that they normally do, and we're going to be seeing less and less representation of minorities and genders and women in today's workforce. So, is there anything we can really do about this? This comes to part of the presentation where I say, what can we do about this? What kind of steps can we take in order to change this? Well, the first one is going to disappoint you. Relatively nothing. The fact is that these are deep-rooted macroeconomic problems that have not been addressed fully for a long time. We've enacted a number of different programs, we've enacted a number of different systems to try and curb this kind of problem. But overall, there has generally been no real, as you've seen from the graph, there's been really, only within the last 10 years have we only seen real massive change in this system. So, it's going to take a generation or more of people trying and fighting for change in the United States workforce in order to curb this problem. The thing is that I need to point out to you guys is that this problem will not get easier to fix the longer it does not go on. The longer this problem goes on, the longer it's going to take to try and fix these problems, because the development, once the development is already in place, it's gone for good. So what can we do about it? What things can we right now do about it to try and fix this problem? First things first, I like to start with the idea, leave no stone unturned. There are a number of different articles and scholarly sources that I consulted when I was doing this presentation that basically talked about how, there's a difference in education, there's a difference in poverty level, there's a difference in overall upbringing, there's a difference in this and that. And none of them could really point out a single issue. So my answer to this, leave no stone unturned. Increase in education spending and increase in spending in lower income areas. Increase racial inclusion incentives, basically tax incentives or subsidization incentives that give money and give tax breaks to companies or industries that reach a certain amount of diversity, things like that. Develop new industries for future labor forces to utilize. There are a number of industries today that still exist that are still very heavily labor-based. There's a lot of different products that we use every single day that we can only make, we can only use if somebody is physically there building them. Carpentry, different parts of the mechanical industry, different vocational things, things like that we can utilize to employ future labor forces. And finally, one of the things I want to end on is that capitalism, for the most part, is a system that will eventually run out, given enough time. One of the things we've seen throughout the last 150 years is that the amount of difference between someone in the middle class and someone in the upper class is virtually nothing. They can buy higher clothes, but the relative death rates, poverty rates, things like that, they're actually starting to decrease exponentially. And so the standard of living for the median class, for the lower class, has actually been improving very, very quickly over the last 100 years. And so the relative importance of a capitalistic-based society has actually been decreasing pretty greatly over the last 100 years. So the last point I'd like to end on is that begin taking steps towards eventual unemployment, because eventually we're going to get to a point where the few jobs that are out there are going to be filled by either people who have the best connections or are best qualified. And so we may get to a point eventually where we as a capitalistic society need to decide whether or not we're going to be capitalistic or not. But then again, that problem is not going to occur for several hundred years or more. It's probably something I will definitely not see in my lifetime, but nevertheless, it's an important issue that we need to talk about. This whole issue that I've talked about today, this whole subject matter that I've talked about today, is something that needs to keep happening in today's classrooms, in today's workforces, in today's production management meetings, because it's vitally important to the entire economy that we work on this issue together. Even if it's a small issue, we can work towards that issue, we can fix it. Thank you guys so much for your attention. I really appreciate everything. You guys have a wonderful day.